Keep your best years ahead. Longevity Roadmap with Dr. Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. This is Buck Joffrey, and today my guest is Martin Gibala. He's a professor in the Department of Kinesiology at McMaster University. He's a renowned scientist for his research on specifically high-intensity interval training, otherwise known as HIIT. In 2005, he and his colleagues at McMaster University demonstrated that short bursts of high-intensity physical activity could yield substantial health benefits, and his research ultimately culminated in the publication of the 1-minute workout. Science shows a way to get fit that's smarter, faster, and shorter. And for that, he received an HK award from the University of Windsor. But he's authored over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, with lots of his findings getting notice from major publications such as the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Martin, why don't we start with this? I guess, to start, I think just in general, people hear about HIIT. It's become sort of a very popular term in the workout world. But what exactly is high-intensity interval training? And I guess as a corollary to that, how is it different from traditional forms of exercise, from steady-state cardio or resistance training?
Sure. So, it's one of these topics that are rediscovered every decade or so. So clearly athletes have used it for over 100 years to train for performance. But over the last 10, 20 years, there's been renewed interest in the application of HIIT in less healthy individuals, average folks, if you will. How I define it, interval training is simply intermittent exercise. So hills and valleys, going relatively harder, taking a break, repeating that pattern, as opposed to the traditional continuous moderate intensity exercise. The $1 million question is, what is high? And so I think the key for your audience is what we're talking about is vigorous, intermittent physical activity. Vigorous is well defined in public health guidelines. So if you're the WHO, vigorous is about a 7 on a 10-point scale.
Okay.
1 is laying on the couch. 10 is sprint from danger, sprint to save your child from an oncoming car. 7 on that scale. We're talking roughly 80% of maximal heart rate, or an effort where you could spit out a couple words. You couldn't carry on a sentence with your workout partner.
Got it. So it's interesting that that's the definition, I guess, because what I've sort of heard just through, listening to people is it's basically this idea of just giving it everything, like 100%. You can't give it anymore, but you're saying, no, it's actually maybe a notch below that.
Correct. So it spans the gamut up to that 10 out of 10 or as hard as you can go pace. And certainly we've done studies looking at that. So it can be a very potent form of training, but I think it's a misnomer, and why I think some people turn away from it initially, especially physicians, or people think, oh my goodness, this is a heart attack waiting to happen. I would never prescribe this. That's one flavor. But again, we're just talking about getting into that vigorous intermittent range. And that's the type of high intensity interval training that has been widely applied to people with type 2 diabetes, older individuals, in a cardiac rehab setting. So we wouldn't ask those people to sprint from danger pace, but we're getting into that vigorous intermittent type work.
So what makes this HIIT unique in terms of its impact on the body compared to other forms of exercise? I generally have been talking a lot about, the benefits of level 2 cardio, which is essentially this level where you're able to keep it for a long time. You're able to keep going for a long time, but, and you can talk to somebody, but it's not super easy to talk to somebody. It's like climbing a hill and talking, that kind of thing. And obviously there's lots of evidence for the benefits of that too, but maybe you could explain the physiological mechanisms at play with HIIT that are different from that kind of exercise.
Yeah, and so certainly zone 2 is sort of having a moment right now. Happy to offer some thoughts on
Sure,
on
that'd
that.
be great too.
But I like to think that, the underlying physiological system is the same. We can trigger responses in different ways. So I don't think there's something magical about high intensity interval training. What it does, it enables typically some time savings, and the relative time savings depend on how hard you're willing and able to work. So definitely we can have very potent remodeling of the physiological system. We can have increases in mitochondrial content. We can have increases in cardiorespiratory fitness. So enhanced cardiac output, enhanced elasticity of your blood vessels with a shorter time commitment or smaller volume of exercise than when we associate with a more traditional moderate intensity continuous exercise. And so I think that's how people should think of it. If there's an efficiency in air quote to high intensity interval training, it's around the time aspect. And the greater the time savings, the more intense you have to work out in order to derive those benefits.
So you're kind of almost looking at, can I think about it in terms of like physics principles? It's like almost like work, right? Like the total amount of work you're doing. You could either do it over a longer period of time and not as intense, or you could do it really intense for a short. Would that be a reasonable way to look at it?
It is. And then the question becomes, are we talking biological work or work, for example, on a bike, right? Like work rate on a bike. But in terms of biological work, that's a really good way to think of it. And the way that we normally make these comparisons is typically by estimating energy expenditure or the oxygen uptake that people are working at. And so I'm often at, again, $1 million question is how to HIIT compare to zone 2 or the traditional stuff. And there's two ways to look at it. One is what I call the apples to apples comparison. So we're going to compare a given dose of the traditional moderate intensity continuous against the same equal work of HIIT. And there, I think there's some compelling evidence that HIIT will elicit superior responses, especially, and if there's one big one, it's cardiorespiratory fitness, which, is our best indicator to my mind of overall health and disease risk.
If I could stop you there, you're measuring that vis-a-vis VO2 max, I presume?
Exactly. In all our studies, we do objectively measured VO2 max in a lab with a treadmill and metabolic cart.
Got it. So VO2 max, very clearly, you're going to get more benefit, more ability to increase that using HIIT versus level 2 regimen.
Yeah, and I think there's very compelling data for that now. And one of the reasons why athletes utilize HIIT, any high-level endurance athlete utilizes HIIT, in part because they know it's going to optimize physiological responses and performance.
So would you, Martin, if you were thinking about this in your mind, the way you see it, would there even be a role for level 2 if you could just do HIIT?
Yeah, there is. And so my first question to that would be, what's your outcome of interest? Is it general health? Is it performance? Is it glycemic control? If it's general health and fitness, the other thing is, what are you willing and able to do? What's the individual? And so, our greatest problem writ large, of course, is physical inactivity. And so getting people to do anything is the goal. And so, my best advice is find something you like and enjoy and be consistent at it. If it's interval training, great. If you hate intervals, then there's no compelling reason to do them as long as you're doing something, right? And
right.
Again, our biggest goal is trying to move people out of that lowest fitness range. But, all things being equal, I do think people should add some vigorous physical activity to their weekly fitness regime. And, the other way to think of it is elite athletes train 80-20, 80% low, moderate intensity training, 20% high intensity intervals. And that's a really good recipe for performance. Where I quibble a bit with the zone 2 zealots, if I can use that term, is the assumption that 80-20 mix is perfect for everyone. So if you're only doing physical activity guidelines, or you're only doing 30 minutes of physical activity a week, I would dispute that 80-20 is best there. You should be doing so much zone 2, because I think there's a very high barrier to entry with zone 2 if you're starting by telling people you got to do 3 to 4 hours a week of it.
Let me ask you this way, because I think what I'm trying to figure out is, if you are committed to doing interval training and doing it, would you gain additional benefit from doing the level 2 as well? I mean, what are you not getting?
No, it's a great question. I think if you're willing and able to do HIIT, I think you could absolutely make a compelling argument that a HIIT-only approach or a largely HIIT-based approach is an extremely efficient way to train. I don't think if you're training for general health, fitness, longevity, you're leaving a lot on the table if you cut out a lot of the traditional zone 2 stuff. Now, if you're training for performance and you're training 25 hours a week, obviously I think you have to do a lot of zone 2, and it's a part, cyclists talk about time in the seat or time in the saddle. There's lots of other responses that are probably stimulated there. But if your goal is mainly just fitness and you're looking for an efficient way to train, I think HIIT provides a lot of bang for your buck.
So what is it about HIIT that necessarily is helping you, which is making it clearly superior to level 2 exercise in terms of increasing VO2 max? Would that have something to do with its effects perhaps on the mitochondria?
It would, VO2 max big picture obviously is largely determined by oxygen delivery, and that's mainly the cardiovascular system, and oxygen utilization, and that's mainly the mitochondria in your muscles. I think the best evidence would suggest it's largely a delivery problem. So if I take 100 of your listeners and we measure their VO2 max, and it's going to be different between everyone, the biggest parameter that would predict those differences is cardiac output, and specifically their stroke volume. So the functional capacity of the heart, its ability to pump blood. Mitochondria, all of these other things are important, but I think it's largely a delivery issue. And so for why HIIT is better, or when we do that apples to apples comparison, I would submit, and I think there's good data to suggest that it's probably because the cardiac output changes that you get when you do more high intensity work are superior compared to the traditional moderate steady state.
Again, when you're comparing those two also, you mentioned some benefits in particular for HIIT for metabolic control, for diabetics, for type 2 diabetics, things like that. Is there, I presume you're saying that it is a superior for metabolic physiology. And if that's the case, why? Why is it?
So the most compelling data would relate to cardiorespiratory fitness, in part because it's so easy to measure, right? Yeah. It's relatively non-invasive. If we're talking a thing, there's less data for glycemic control, although there's definitely compelling data, using either continuous glucose monitoring, various indices of insulin sensitivity to suggest that HIIT, when it's work matched, might be better. But I want to be cautious here. The level of evidence there is not like we have for VO2. Why it might be better is, things like glucose transport capacity, we know are related to intensity of exercise or physical activity. And we've definitely done studies like this where when we do vigorous intermittent exercise, including in older individuals with obesity who have type 2 diabetes, we can measure very rapid and marked changes in their glucose transport capacity in their muscles. So definitely it's related to that. The other idea is the vigorous intermittent nature. If you get more stimulus, so you can imagine you get the various metabolic signals in your muscles that respond. One way to think of it is you have this metabolic disturbance at the start of continuous exercise, and then it just sort of continues. But if you have these greater transitions, so more of these rest to work transitions, perhaps those metabolic disturbances, those metabolic fluctuations are greater, and they sort of sum up over time, and that can lead to a greater physiological response.
It's interesting because I think about the different sports too. You're Canadian over there. I grew up in Minnesota. I was an ice hockey player. That's what we did, right? It was hit after hit after hit. Is there any studies that look at different kinds of sports for, these types of responses?
Yeah, there are. And so I still play a weekly pickup ice hockey game myself. But, team sports typically are stop and go. And so those are very good examples. And yes, there's studies out of Denmark that have looked at basically small-sided games, small-sided football, for example, small-sided soccer, showing that type of stop and go activity in a team sport setting is associated with improvements in VO2 peak and health-related markers. So I think team sport is a great example of these principles in action.
So one of the the most compelling things I think we talked about today is the effect on VO2 max, and specifically because we talk about longevity. But VO2 max, I believe, is the number one predictor of longevity. Isn't that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the data there are compelling compared to the other things that we'd measure in a physician's office, like cigarette smoking and high blood pressure. Yes.
Yeah. So are there specific populations, older adults or individuals with chronic health conditions who stand to benefit the most from HIIT? I mean, do you think elderly, should the elderly be out focusing on this in particular?
Yeah, I think, we hear these public health messages and they're well-founded, move more, sit less. Absolutely nothing wrong with that message. But getting the message out, huff and puff a bit or huff and puff regularly as you go about your day. So a lot of my research has been small proof of concept studies. We're starting to do some multi-center randomized controlled trials, but I've also been involved with some work led out of Australia looking at the epidemiological side of things and looking at large numbers of individuals. And in one study, we followed 25,000 individuals who were wearing accelerometers. These are data from the UK Biobank, showing that even 4 to 5 minutes a day, daily 4 to 5 minute dose of vigorous physical activity. You can imagine climbing the stairs, sprinting for the bus with your heavy backpack, those types of activities, 4 to 5 minutes a day, associated with a 25% reduction in all-cause mortality and a larger reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. So it doesn't take a lot. And to your question, yes, I think especially folks who identify as non-exercisers, people who might have, they're not completely healthy, older individuals, those people can engage in vigorous intermittent type physical activity and benefit from it. And again, we're not talking sprinting to save your child. We're talking getting into that vigorous range. Sometimes we'll tell people, look, just get out of your comfort zone. Whatever your regular physical activity is, if it's walking around the block at night with your partner or going to get the mail, pick up the pace for a few light posts and back off. And that simple messaging, there's studies to show that can be very, very beneficial.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you, sort of just for selfish purposes also, but I think it'll be illustrative. So I work out, 6-7 times a week. And, every day pretty much I'm doing, at least 40 minutes of level 2 myself right now. And for somebody who's like me, what would be sort of the minimal effective dose of adding HIIT to increase VO2 max?
Yeah. So a couple protocols. And again, I guess my first question would be, what do you like? Do you like the real short, really hard stuff, or do you like the little longer stuff, but less intense? And so let me give you 3 example workouts.
Okay.
One would be a 4x4. So this is a classic Norwegian protocol, 4 4-minute efforts at a good hard pace, right? So you're getting into a pace there where, you're getting up to 85, 90% of your maximal heart rate if you're interested in measuring your heart rate, or you're using a pace where, the 3 to 4 minute range of those intervals, you wouldn't want to go a lot more, right? So you're pushing pretty hard, right? And so you use that hill example, so you're riding, okay, the hill's coming, it's going to be a 4-minute climb. When you start out, you're like, okay, I can manage this, but minute 3 of that 4-minute climb, you're like, okay, I'm ready to be done. So 4 4-minute pushes like that would be an example interval workout. Another one would be a 5x1, 5 1-minute efforts, right? So that's only 5 minutes, but those 1-minute efforts are going to be even harder, right?
On an assault bike, for example.
Exactly, right? And then the last one would be 3 20-second all-out sprints, right? Those are really, really uncomfortable, But, you can see there, that's a range from 1 minute of intervals, which sounds easy, to 16 minutes of interval exercise. But the relative intensities there would be different. All of those have been shown, if you did any of those even twice a week, added to your regime, maybe you dropped one of the zone 2 workouts and you added, 1 or 2 of these interval workouts and you did that for a couple of weeks, I think you'd see an improvement in your fitness.
What, in your opinion though, like what should, like based on your research, like what's the ideal thing? I mean, for someone, again, like for me, would you say, hey, you don't need to do this level 2 stuff? Just is that what you, from your research, is that what you would conclude?
Yeah, again, I don't want to be that scientist who keeps hedging, but if there's one thing I've come to appreciate, there's not a lot of absolutes, right? Or we can have absolutes, but it doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to give some variety here, and my question would be, well, do you enjoy the zone 2 stuff, right? Do you like, getting on the bike, maybe watching your favorite show for 40 minutes and, you get a bit of a sweat on by the end, but you're not really, you're not pushing too hard, but that's going to be effective to maintain.
Yeah, I think that's what most people do. I mean, that's what I do. I mean, frankly, listen, level 2, I always say, there's good data that it's good for you. And it's also very easy to do, right? Like you can think during level 2. So it makes it so easy to listen to podcasts and makes it easy to function and get it done.
No, absolutely. Right. And so, there's no doubt, there's no free lunch here at the end of the day, right? A vigorous exercise is a more uncomfortable form. Now, a lot of people are like, you know what? I could get away with a 15-minute interval workout rather than a 40-minute, I'm okay to forego the podcast, or I'm going to put in a shorter podcast.
Yeah.
I know it's going to be a little uncomfortable for 15 minutes. Or the other thing I would ask is, on those days where it's really busy, right? You're like, I got a choice here. I can blow my workout off, or, I'm just not going to get it in today. Or you're traveling, right? The classic hotel room workout. I can't find a bike. The elliptical's not there. I don't want to run outside for 40 minutes. What am I going to do? Well, you could do a 15-minute or 10-minute, body weight style interval training workout in your room and know that you're going to get a quality workout in there. So mix and match, substitute once in a while, or I would say ideally add one of those examples that I gave you at least once a week, and you're probably going to see some benefit. But, if your goal is just, I want to maintain my fitness as I age, absolutely nothing wrong with the zone 2 stuff.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't really ask you about your take on resistance exercise. I mean, but, any ideas there that maybe, relate to the zone 2 stuff, the HIIT stuff that might not be all over the place?
Obviously resistance exercise is critical to add, arguably it becomes more important as we get older, although we could have a good debate there. I would say that with HIIT, but again, I just mentioned body weight style interval training. It's a fantastic hybrid, right? You're going to get some improvements. You see classic functional strength improvements. And you keep the recovery period short, you're going to see an improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness as well. Now, you're not going to get as strong as heavy resistance exercise. You're not going to get as aerobically fit as if you were doing hours and hours a week of training. But again, a pretty good hybrid, right? So adding some body weight, simple functional style calisthenic movements, an outstanding way, I think, to train.
What are some of the things to be careful of? I mean, obviously, this is the kind of thing where sometimes people make mistakes. You might get inspired, but any thoughts and just like, things to be careful about if you're going to do this stuff?
Yeah, no, for sure. You're a physician. I'm not, but obviously the classic, anytime you're going to start or change your workout, ideally you want to have a chat with your physician. I think we're kidding ourselves to think that everyone is going to get a 12-lead ECG stress test before they engage in vigorous exercise. I think people need to remember, all of us right now, the government recommends that we do moderate to vigorous exercise, including older individuals. So when you think of HIIT as just in that vigorous range, that's sort of what I think will alleviate some of the anxiety around high intensity interval training. start slow, start low and go slow. So as you're breaking into intervals, don't try to be a hero. Get out of your comfort zone to start. Try it out. Get a little bit more out of breath than you're used to, and then back off. In terms of the risk, right? There's two. There's the cardiovascular risk. That's associated with the very vigorous stuff, right? And so, but also people need to remember there's data out there, very good data. A single weekly bout of HIIT is protective in terms of all-cause mortality. So if your choice is, staying sedentary or engaging in that weekly ice hockey game, you're much better engaging in that weekly game of ice hockey. The other is, we talk about musculoskeletal risk of high-intensity interval training. People say, oh, this is really injurious. Well, that really depends. I can exercise very intensely on a bike with very little soreness or MSK risk. If I'm going to go bounding up the stairs or bounding up hills outside, yeah, that could be. So it really depends on the mode of exercise that you're doing.
Yeah. What's your take on some of these various HIIT equipment? Like, I think I saw like an AI bike and all that. And do you buy any of this stuff, or any of it legit?
It really depends, but there's an old saying, the worse the bike, the better the workout. and so, the really high tech stuff, it makes it too easy for you. Yeah. But I think people need to, HIIT is not a specific method or specific piece of equipment or a specific program. It's an approach, right? It's vigorous intermittent exercise, which you can do old school calisthenics, right? Doesn't require any special equipment or even much space, or you can buy into some sort of high-tech HIIT piece of equipment. Again, it's whatever you like, right? If investing in that piece of equipment is going to get you motivated to do it, sure. Or if you like a specific program, and the monthly cost is going to get you to go to your HIIT classes, great. But otherwise, you can do it really simple and really cheap, and you don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah. Is there value? Is there a lot of value in continuously trying to push those numbers up? I mean, because we talked about minimal effective dose, but I mean, if you want to, is there a lot of value in trying to go, okay, so I used to do 5 1 minutes. Now I'm going to do 10 1 minutes. Is there, at what point does it become too much potentially?
Yeah, I think obviously you do ideally want to, it's the classic, as we stress the system, overload, we adapt, we get better. So the same stimulus provides less of a stimulus after a while. So I do think you have to increase absolute intensity over time. Just as you get more fit, keep that stimulus there. It doesn't mean you have to go from 5 to 10 to 20, because that takes away the time efficiency. So as long as the absolute load or speed that you're going at, or reps in a minute, is increasing, you're going to keep that effective stimulus maintained.
It's really interesting stuff, Martin. And this book, The 1 Minute Workout, where do we get that? Is that available everywhere?
Yeah, it is. And, where the title comes from, it's some of these studies on these 3 20-second all-out efforts, which we show to be very effective, but of course, takes a little bit longer. But yeah, it's on Audible. You can find it typically anywhere now.
Where can we learn more about your work?
Yeah, they can go to my website, martingibala.com. I try to keep updated links to podcast interviews, a little bit more about me, or follow me on X at GibalaM, and happy to engage.
Fantastic. This is really good stuff. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.